Imagine believing you hold the greatest secret in the world, that your words are hidden behind walls no enemy can climb, that every message you send travels through invisible protection that cannot be touched or broken. Now imagine discovering that for years, every single word you whispered, every plan you crafted, every movement you ordered was being read by the very enemy you sought to destroy. This is not a story of simple failure or bad luck. This is the story of Japanese admirals during World War II who believed their communication codes were unbreakable, who trusted their technology and their methods completely, only to learn in the most devastating way possible that their enemy had been listening to everything all along. The shock that rippled through the Japanese naval command when they finally understood the truth would shake their confidence, alter their strategies, and ultimately contribute to their defeat in the Pacific War. This is the story of how brilliant codebreakers, patient intelligence officers, and determined mathematicians broke what was thought to be impossible, and how the discovery of that breakthrough shattered the certainty of some of the most powerful military leaders in the world. Long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military understood the importance of secret communication. As Japan expanded its empire throughout Asia and prepared for conflict with Western powers, protecting military secrets became essential to their strategy. The Japanese Navy developed a complex coding system that they believed represented the peak of communication security. This system was not simple or crude. Japanese cryptographers spent years developing methods that combined traditional coding techniques with modern technology, creating layers of protection that seemed impossible to penetrate. The codes used substitution methods, transposition techniques, and constantly changing cipher keys that required specific codebooks to understand. The Japanese admirals looked at their communication system with pride and confidence, believing they had created something that would keep their plans safe throughout any coming war. They tested their codes, they refined them, and they trusted them completely. This trust became the foundation of their strategic planning, allowing admirals to communicate freely across vast ocean distances, coordinating fleet movements, planning attacks, and sharing intelligence without fear that enemy forces could understand their messages. The confidence was so strong that it became part of Japanese military culture, an unquestioned assumption that shaped how they fought the war. While Japanese admirals celebrated their secure communications, American intelligence officers faced a daunting challenge. As tensions rose between Japan and the United States through the late 1930s, American military leaders understood they needed to know what Japan was planning. Traditional spying methods had limited success, and the vast Pacific Ocean made physical surveillance nearly impossible. The answer lay in signals intelligence, the art and science of intercepting and decoding enemy communications. The United States began building a code-breaking operation that would eventually become one of the most important secret weapons of the entire war. This effort started small, with just a handful of cryptographers working in cramped offices with limited resources. These early codebreakers faced Japanese communication systems that seemed impossibly complex, filled with unknown characters, unfamiliar language structures, and constantly changing patterns. The Japanese language itself presented enormous challenges, with its combination of kanji characters borrowed from Chinese, along with two separate syllabary systems called hiragana and katakana. American codebreakers had to first learn the language, then understand the military terminology, and finally crack the mathematical and logical structures of the codes themselves. This was not work that could be rushed or forced. It required patience, intelligence, creativity, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. One of the first major Japanese coding systems that American cryptographers tackled was a diplomatic cipher that Americans called Purple. The Japanese had developed an encryption machine for their diplomatic communications that they considered absolutely secure. This machine used electrical switches and rotors to scramble messages in ways that created millions of possible combinations. Breaking Purple required not just mathematical skill, but also engineering genius, because the Americans needed to figure out how the machine worked without ever seeing one. A team led by cryptographer William Friedman worked exhaustively on this problem through 1939 and 1940. Friedman and his colleagues analyzed intercepted messages, looking for patterns, testing theories, and slowly building an understanding of how the purple machine operated. After months of intense work that pushed some team members to mental and physical exhaustion, they finally succeeded in building a replica of the purple machine and could read Japanese diplomatic traffic. This breakthrough gave American leaders insight into Japanese diplomatic thinking and strategy, but it was only the beginning. The purple machine handled diplomatic communications, but military communications, especially naval messages, used completely different systems. The Japanese Navy employed a code known as JN-25, which would become the primary target for American naval intelligence as war approached. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier planes attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, bringing the United States fully into World War II. The attack shocked America and appeared to demonstrate Japanese military superiority and strategic surprise. What made the attack even more devastating for American intelligence officers was that they had intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages before the attack that indicated war was coming, but they had not been able to read Japanese Navy codes well enough to know where or when Japan would strike. This failure made breaking Japanese naval codes a matter of desperate national importance. After Pearl Harbor, the United States poured resources into the code-breaking effort, expanding teams, recruiting the brightest mathematical minds, and creating dedicated facilities for signals intelligence work. The main effort focused on Station Hypo, the code-breaking unit located at Pearl Harbor itself, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Station Hypo became a round-the-clock operation where cryptographers, language experts, and intelligence analysts worked together to crack JN-25 and other Japanese Navy codes. The work was grueling and frustrating, with team members often working 30-hour shifts, sleeping at their desks, and returning immediately to the effort when they woke. Progress came slowly, one small breakthrough leading to another, each decoded message providing clues that helped unlock more messages. The Japanese Navy code, designated JN-25 by American intelligence, was a super-encrypted code that combined code groups with cipher additives. Understanding how it worked requires imagining multiple layers of protection. First, Japanese operators would take a plain message written in Japanese and convert it into 5-digit code groups using a codebook. Each word or phrase had a corresponding 5-digit number. Then, to add another layer of security, operators would add 5-digit numbers from an additive book to each code group, creating a new 5-digit number. The additive books changed regularly, and without knowing both the original code book and the additive book being used, breaking the code seemed nearly impossible. Japanese cryptographers had created a system they believed could not be broken without capturing both codebooks and additive tables, and they took extensive precautions to protect these materials. Ships carried special bags weighted with lead that would sink the codebooks if the ship was in danger of capture. Officers had strict orders to destroy coding materials before they could fall into enemy hands. The Japanese Navy trusted this system completely, never imagining that patient analysis and brilliant mathematical work could unravel it without ever seeing the actual codebooks. Breaking JN-25 was not a single dramatic moment, but rather a series of incremental victories that built upon each other over months. American cryptographers used every tool available to them, including mathematics, linguistics, pattern recognition, and educated guessing. They looked for messages that seemed likely to contain certain words like battleship or carrier, and used those guesses to test possible code groups. They analyzed the frequency of different 5-digit groups, knowing that some words appear more often than others in any language. They compared messages sent at different times looking for repeated patterns. They made thousands of educated guesses, testing each one methodically. Most guesses led nowhere, but occasionally one would unlock a small piece of the code, revealing a few words or phrases. Those small pieces became building blocks for understanding more messages. The work required not just intelligence but also intuition, the ability to think like the enemy and guess what they might be saying. As American cryptographers recovered more code groups and began understanding the structure of the additive tables, the percentage of each message they could read slowly increased. By early 1942, Station Hypo could read perhaps 15 to 20% of intercepted Japanese Navy messages. That might not sound like much, but it was enough to begin understanding Japanese operations and movements. Throughout this period, Japanese admirals continued to trust their codes completely. They had no reason to doubt the security of their communications. Their cryptographers assured them the codes were unbreakable, and no captured materials or intelligence suggested otherwise. Japanese naval officers communicated freely, discussing detailed operational plans over radio, because they believed the codes protected them completely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant commander who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, used coded messages to coordinate the movements of vast fleets across thousands of miles of ocean. Other Japanese admirals did the same, directing submarines, planning invasion operations, and coordinating air attacks, all through messages they believed were completely secure. This confidence shaped Japanese strategy in fundamental ways. Because they trusted their communications, Japanese forces could operate with more coordination and flexibility than would otherwise be possible. Fleet commanders could adjust plans in response to changing situations, sending updated orders by radio that reached ships quickly. This seemed like a tremendous advantage, allowing Japanese forces to respond rapidly to developments. What the admirals never suspected was that their greatest perceived strength was actually becoming their greatest vulnerability. By spring of 1942, Commander Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo were making steady progress on JN-25, but they were racing against time and fighting exhaustion. The cryptographers worked in a basement room with no windows, lit by harsh artificial lights, breathing stale air, and living on coffee and determination. Rochefort himself often wore a smoking jacket and slippers at work, caring nothing for military appearance and everything for results. The team intercepted Japanese radio traffic constantly, capturing thousands of encrypted messages. Each message became a puzzle piece, something that might contain a vital clue or might be routine traffic. The cryptographers had to make constant decisions about which messages to focus on, which patterns seemed most promising, and how to allocate their limited time and energy. The pressure was enormous because everyone knew that Japanese forces were planning major operations somewhere in the Pacific, and if Station Hypo could break enough messages to learn where the Japanese would strike next, American forces might be able to prepare a defense or even an ambush. But if they failed to break the codes in time, more American ships would be sunk, more American lives would be lost, and Japanese expansion would continue unchecked. In May of 1942, Station Hypo began intercepting Japanese messages that referenced a major upcoming operation against a target designated only as AF. The Americans could read enough of the messages to know that Japan was planning a massive operation involving multiple carrier groups, battleships, and invasion forces, all directed at this mysterious location called AF. But what was AF? Different intelligence analysts had different theories. Some thought AF might be Hawaii, that Japan was planning a second attack on Pearl Harbor. Others thought it might be islands along the Aleutian chain near Alaska, or perhaps islands in the South Pacific. Commander Rochefort analyzed the pattern of messages and became convinced that AF was Midway, a small atoll northwest of Hawaii that served as an American outpost. If Rochefort was right, this was intelligence of absolutely critical importance. If he was wrong, and American forces prepared to defend Midway while Japan struck somewhere else, the mistake could be catastrophic. Rochefort needed to prove his theory, and he devised a clever plan to do exactly that. He arranged for the American base at Midway to send a message in a code that Japan could read, reporting that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down and the base was short of fresh water. Soon after, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The proof was complete. AF was definitely Midway, and now American forces knew exactly where Japan would strike. Armed with this intelligence, American commanders prepared to meet the Japanese attack with every resource they could gather. 3 American aircraft carriers that might have been elsewhere were rushed to the waters near Midway. American planes were positioned to provide maximum defensive coverage. The forces were carefully positioned to create an ambush, hiding beyond where Japanese scouts were expected to search, while maintaining position to strike when the Japanese fleet was most vulnerable. The Japanese fleet approaching Midway was powerful, including 4 large aircraft carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports. Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier striking force, completely unaware that the Americans knew he was coming. Nagumo and his fellow admirals operated under their usual assumption that their coded messages were secure, that their plans were secret, and that they would achieve tactical surprise. They expected to find Midway defended only by the small garrison already there, with no American carriers nearby. The Japanese plan called for carrier planes to attack Midway's defenses first, then for the fleet to support an amphibious landing that would capture the atoll. What the Japanese admirals did not know was that American carriers were waiting, hidden and ready to strike at the exact moment when Japanese ships would be most vulnerable. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 became one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. American forces, guided by their intelligence advantage, caught the Japanese fleet at the worst possible moment. Japanese carriers had just recovered planes from the first Midway strike and were preparing planes for a second strike when American dive bombers arrived overhead. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning and fatally damaged. A 4th Japanese carrier was destroyed later the same day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of their most experienced pilots. The American victory was stunning and turned the tide of the Pacific War. For Japanese admirals, the defeat at Midway was shocking and devastating, but what made it worse was the growing suspicion that somehow the Americans had known where they would strike. The tactical situation at Midway had seemed too perfectly arranged, the American forces too well positioned, the timing too precise to be mere luck. Japanese naval officers began questioning whether their codes might be compromised, whether the security they had trusted so completely might actually be broken. However, Japanese cryptographers assured the admirals that the codes were still secure, that breaking JN-25 was mathematically impossible, and that the Americans must have obtained their intelligence through other means, perhaps spies or reconnaissance. Despite these reassurances, doubt had entered the minds of some Japanese officers. Captain Kamido Kurashima, a staff officer who had helped plan the Midway operation, suspected that code compromise might explain the devastating defeat. Other officers shared his concerns quietly, but the institutional momentum of the Japanese Navy worked against changing the codes. Changing coding systems across an entire navy operating across millions of square miles of ocean was an enormous undertaking. It required printing and distributing new codebooks, training all communications personnel in new procedures, and accepting a period of confusion and possible errors as everyone adjusted to the new system. Such a change also required admitting that the old system might be compromised, which implied that previous operations might have been exposed, and that losses might have resulted from Japanese security failures rather than American superiority. This was a difficult admission for a proud military culture to make. Japanese cryptographers also pointed out that no physical evidence of code compromise existed. No codebooks had been captured that might have been copied before being destroyed. No Japanese communications personnel had defected to the Americans. The Japanese could not imagine how codes could be broken without these physical materials, and since such compromise seemed impossible, they convinced themselves that it must not have happened. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commanding genius of the Japanese Navy, made a decision in April 1943 that would ultimately prove fatal, a decision enabled by his continued trust in Japanese codes. American intelligence had been tracking Yamamoto's movements and activities through decoded messages, learning that the admiral planned to make an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands. The decoded messages revealed exact details of Yamamoto's schedule, including his departure time, his route, and his arrival time at Ballil Airfield near Bougainville. This intelligence reached the highest levels of American command, all the way to President Franklin Roosevelt, who had to decide whether to authorize a mission to intercept and kill Yamamoto. The decision was difficult because successfully shooting down Yamamoto's plane might reveal to the Japanese that their codes were broken, potentially causing them to change their coding systems and eliminating America's intelligence advantage. However, Yamamoto was Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, and removing him from the war might be worth the risk. Roosevelt authorized the mission. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport plane exactly where and when the decoded messages said it would be, shooting it down over the jungle and killing the admiral. The death of Yamamoto sent shock waves through the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto was not just a skilled commander, but a symbol of Japanese naval power, the man who had led them to victories and shaped their strategy. His sudden death in what appeared to be a precisely targeted ambush raised immediate questions. How had the Americans known exactly where Yamamoto would be at that exact moment? The probability of a random encounter seemed impossibly small. Some Japanese officers again raised concerns about code security, arguing that the Americans must be reading their messages. Once again, however, Japanese cryptographers and intelligence officers developed alternative explanations. Perhaps a spy at one of the bases had reported Yamamoto's schedule. Perhaps American coast watchers in the Solomon Islands had spotted the planes and called in fighters. Perhaps it was an unlucky coincidence, with American planes on a routine patrol happening to encounter Yamamoto's flight. These explanations were possible, even if they seemed less likely than code compromise, and they allowed the Japanese Navy to avoid the difficult organizational change that new coding systems would require. The Japanese made some modifications to their codes after Yamamoto's death, changing some additive tables and procedures, but they did not implement the complete systematic overhaul that would have been necessary to truly secure their communications. American cryptographers adapted to the minor changes within weeks and continued reading Japanese Navy messages. Throughout 1943 and 1944, American intelligence continued to exploit Japanese naval codes with devastating effectiveness. The intelligence advantage shaped nearly every major engagement in the Pacific. American submarines used decoded messages to locate Japanese convoys and tankers, sinking crucial supply ships and strangling Japan's resource-starved economy. American commanders knew in advance when Japanese forces were being reinforced, when supply missions were planned, and when fleet units were moving. This intelligence allowed American forces to choose when to fight and when to avoid battle, to concentrate forces where they would be most effective, and to anticipate Japanese responses to American moves. The intelligence advantage was so valuable that American commanders went to extraordinary lengths to protect the secret of how they obtained their information. Combat commanders were instructed to always send out reconnaissance planes before acting on intelligence to create a plausible explanation for how they discovered enemy positions. Intelligence was sometimes disguised as having come from coast watchers or other sources. Orders were carefully worded to avoid revealing the specific details that came from decoded messages. These precautions helped maintain the secret and prevented the Japanese from fully understanding how compromised their communications had become. As the war continued and Japanese defeats mounted, more voices within the Japanese Navy began questioning code security. The pattern was too consistent, with American forces too often in the right place at the right time, knowing too much about Japanese plans and movements. Some intelligence officers compiled evidence of possible code compromise, showing examples where American responses seemed too perfectly timed or too specifically targeted to be explained by luck or conventional intelligence gathering. However, these concerns continued to meet resistance from the cryptographic establishment and from senior officers who did not want to believe that a system they had trusted for years could be fundamentally flawed. The institutional resistance to accepting code compromise was strong and had multiple sources. Changing the coding system was expensive and disruptive. Admitting that codes had been broken implied that previous defeats were partly the result of Japanese failures rather than American superiority, which was a painful admission. The mathematical arguments that breaking the codes without captured materials should be impossible seemed convincing. And perhaps most fundamentally, the human mind tends to resist information that contradicts deeply held beliefs, and the security of Japanese codes had become a deeply held belief. While Japanese admirals struggled with growing suspicions and continued denial, the American code-breaking effort expanded into a massive industrial operation. By mid-war, thousands of people were involved in signals intelligence work across multiple facilities. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor worked alongside similar units in Washington, in Australia, and across the Pacific. Listening posts intercepted Japanese radio traffic from locations scattered across the ocean. Banks of IBM machines processed intercepted messages, searching for patterns and testing possible decryptions. Teams of translators converted decoded Japanese messages into English. Intelligence analysts synthesized information from decoded messages with other intelligence sources to create comprehensive pictures of Japanese operations. The entire operation was conducted under intense secrecy, with personnel forbidden from discussing their work with anyone outside the program, including family members. The secrecy was so complete that many people who worked in signals intelligence during the war never learned the full scope of what they had contributed to, understanding only their small piece of the larger effort. This secrecy was essential because the intelligence advantage was so valuable that protecting it was worth enormous effort and sacrifice. When American forces returned to the Philippines in 1944, the invasion was supported by extensive intelligence from decoded Japanese messages. American commanders knew how many Japanese troops defended the islands, where they were positioned, what their supply situation was, and how Japanese commanders planned to respond to American landings. The Japanese Navy committed major fleet units to opposing the American invasion, and American intelligence tracked these movements through decoded messages. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 became the largest naval battle in history, and American commanders had significant intelligence advantages throughout the engagement. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita led a powerful surface force through the San Bernardino Strait intending to attack American landing ships, but American commanders knew he was coming because decoded messages had revealed his route. Japanese plans to use carrier forces as decoys were understood in advance through intelligence. Throughout the complex multi-day battle, American forces benefited from knowing Japanese intentions and movements before they developed. The Japanese lost multiple carriers, battleships, and cruisers at Leyte Gulf, further crippling their already diminished naval power. Japanese admirals could not understand how American forces seemed to anticipate their moves so consistently. As 1945 began and the war moved closer to Japan itself, the Japanese Navy was reduced to a shadow of its former power. Most of their carriers were sunk, fuel shortages restricted operations, and American forces were advancing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. Even in this desperate situation, Japanese forces continued to use codes that American intelligence could read. Plans for kamikaze operations, the movements of surviving ships, and preparations for defending Okinawa and potentially Japan itself were discussed in messages that Americans intercepted and decoded. By this late stage in the war, the strategic impact of the intelligence advantage was less dramatic simply because Japanese forces were so reduced that they had limited options regardless of what the Americans knew. However, the intelligence still provided value in helping American commanders anticipate threats and allocate resources efficiently. Some Japanese officers by this time had become convinced that their codes were compromised and argued forcefully for complete communication security overhauls. But the organizational capacity to implement such changes had been degraded by years of war, and the changes came too late to matter. In the final months before Japan's surrender in August 1945, some Japanese military leaders finally accepted what evidence had suggested for years, that their supposedly unbreakable codes had indeed been broken, and that the Americans had been reading their messages throughout most of the war. The full truth about American code breaking remained classified for years after the war ended. Japanese officers and officials did not learn the complete extent of American signals intelligence success until the 1970s, when the United States began declassifying wartime intelligence materials. When former Japanese admirals and naval officers finally learned how thoroughly and consistently the Americans had read their messages, the shock and dismay were profound. Admiral Shidru Fukudome, who had served in important staff positions during the war, described his reaction to learning about American code breaking as one of complete shock, saying it explained many things that had been mysterious during the war. Other former Japanese naval officers expressed similar reactions, finally understanding how American forces had seemed to anticipate Japanese moves so consistently. The revelation was particularly painful because it meant that Japanese confidence in their code security had been misplaced from the beginning, that their trust in their communications had contributed to their defeat, and that many Japanese deaths might have been prevented if they had recognized the code compromise earlier and taken effective action to secure their communications. For men who had dedicated their lives to the Japanese Navy and who had fought desperately to defend their country, learning that such a fundamental assumption had been wrong was deeply disturbing. Understanding what American cryptographers accomplished requires appreciating the enormous difficulty of what they achieved. They broke a super-encrypted code system designed specifically to resist breaking, without ever capturing the actual codebooks or additive tables that were supposed to be necessary for reading the messages. They did this through a combination of mathematical analysis, linguistic expertise, pattern recognition, educated guessing, and enormous hard work. Cryptographers like Joseph Rochefort, Agnes Mayer Driscoll, and many others whose names remained classified for decades demonstrated intellectual brilliance and determination that matched any achievement of the war. They worked impossible hours under intense pressure, knowing that their success or failure would directly affect whether American sailors lived or died, whether battles were won or lost, and ultimately whether the war would be won. The techniques they developed advanced the entire field of cryptography and signals intelligence. The use of machine processing to analyze intercepted messages, the statistical methods for detecting patterns, the organizational structures for managing large-scale intelligence operations, and the security procedures for protecting sensitive intelligence sources, all emerged from this wartime effort and shaped intelligence work for generations afterward. The strategic impact of American success in reading Japanese Navy codes cannot be overstated. It was one of the most important intelligence achievements of World War II, ranking alongside the British breaking of German Enigma codes in its significance. The intelligence advantage allowed the United States to fight more effectively with fewer resources, to position forces where they would have maximum impact, and to avoid disasters that might have resulted from being surprised by Japanese operations. The victory at Midway, which was directly enabled by reading Japanese plans, came at a critical moment when American forces were still relatively weak in the Pacific, and when a Japanese victory might have delayed American counteroffensives for months or years. The intelligence advantage in submarine warfare, with decoded messages directing submarines to Japanese convoys, devastated Japan's merchant fleet and contributed to the economic strangulation that made it impossible for Japan to sustain its war effort. The intelligence that enabled the shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto removed from the war the one Japanese commander who might have developed more effective strategies to counter American advances. Each of these impacts alone would have been significant, and together they helped determine the war's outcome. The story of Japanese admirals being shocked by code compromise is not just about cryptography and mathematics, but also about organizational culture and decision-making. The Japanese Navy's failure to recognize and respond to code compromise despite mounting evidence reflected several organizational weaknesses. There was excessive confidence in technology and expert assurances without adequate verification. There was institutional resistance to accepting information that contradicted established beliefs. There was difficulty admitting mistakes and changing course even when evidence suggested problems. The organizational culture prioritized avoiding disruption and maintaining established procedures over questioning whether those procedures were still effective. Individual officers who raised concerns about code security faced resistance from the bureaucratic establishment and from senior commanders who did not want to hear bad news. These organizational and cultural factors appear in many historical cases where institutions failed to respond effectively to emerging threats or changing conditions. The Japanese Navy's experience with code security provides a case study in how even intelligent and dedicated people can fail to recognize and act upon information that challenges their fundamental assumptions. Part of what made American code breaking so effective was not just the initial breaking of Japanese codes, but the continued ability to adapt as the Japanese made modifications and changes. Japanese communications security personnel did implement changes to their codes throughout the war, updating additive tables, changing some procedures, and attempting to improve security. However, American cryptographers adjusted to these changes relatively quickly, usually within days or weeks, and maintained their ability to read Japanese messages. This adaptability reflected the depth of American understanding of the Japanese code systems, the quality of the personnel involved in the work, and the resources devoted to maintaining the intelligence advantage. The United States recognized that signals intelligence was a decisive advantage worth protecting and supporting, and allocated people, equipment, and attention accordingly. The organizational priority given to code breaking meant that when Japanese made changes, the American response was rapid and effective. This adaptation and sustained success contrasted with the Japanese side, where concerns about code security were raised, but effective responses were delayed or inadequate. An interesting aspect of this story is the psychological dimension of fighting a war while holding secret knowledge. American commanders who received intelligence from decoded Japanese messages knew things that their opponents did not know they knew. This created an unusual psychological dynamic where American leaders had to act on information while pretending not to have it, making decisions that would seem logical based on conventional intelligence, even when those decisions were actually based on decoded messages. The strain of maintaining this deception while conducting combat operations added another layer of stress to already difficult command responsibilities. On the Japanese side, the admirals operated with false confidence, believing their communications were secure when they were not, trusting that their plans were secret when they were being read by the enemy. This false sense of security led to behaviors that seemed reasonable based on incorrect assumptions, but were actually dangerous. The psychological impact when Japanese officers finally learned the truth years after the war suggests how disturbing it is to discover that fundamental assumptions were wrong, that confidence was misplaced, and that an enemy knew your plans throughout a desperate struggle. The story of breaking Japanese codes and exploiting that intelligence advantage raises questions about the ethics and morality of intelligence warfare. American forces used decoded messages to sink Japanese ships, shoot down Japanese planes, and kill Japanese personnel who had no idea that their communications were compromised. This was clearly advantageous for the American war effort and helped end the war more quickly with fewer American casualties. But it also meant killing people who were placed in danger partly because of Japanese organizational failures to recognize and respond to code compromise. The decision to shoot down Admiral Yamamoto's plane based on decoded intelligence was controversial at the time precisely because it raised ethical questions about targeted assassination and about whether the intelligence advantage was worth risking. These ethical questions have no simple answers. War itself is an ethical crisis where normal moral rules are suspended in pursuit of victory and survival. Intelligence warfare adds layers of deception and secret knowledge that complicate moral judgments further. The historical consensus has generally been that American code breaking and the exploitation of that intelligence advantage were legitimate acts of war that contributed to Allied victory and ultimately to ending the conflict. But the human costs and moral complexities remain worth considering. The success of American code breaking against Japanese naval codes during World War II had lasting impacts on how nations approach communications security and signals intelligence. The techniques developed during the war became foundations for modern cryptography and intelligence work. The organizational structures created to manage large-scale signals intelligence operations evolved into permanent institutions like the National Security Agency in the United States. The lesson that codes believed to be unbreakable might actually be broken through sustained analytical effort influenced how governments approached communications security in the post-war era. The importance of signals intelligence in modern military operations traces directly back to the successes of World War II code breaking. At the same time, the Japanese experience taught important lessons about the dangers of overconfidence in security measures, the importance of continuously testing and verifying security assumptions, and the organizational challenges of responding effectively to security threats. Modern communication security practices, including regular rotation of codes, strict procedures for protecting classified materials, and constant monitoring for signs of compromise, reflect lessons learned from historical failures as well as successes. Behind the strategic and technical aspects of this story are human stories of the people involved. The American cryptographers who worked exhausting hours in basement rooms, sacrificing health and family time to break codes that saved lives. The young sailors on both sides who fought and died, without knowing that intelligence advantages shaped the battles they fought. The Japanese cryptographers who believed in their codes and felt devastated when they learned after the war that their work had been broken. The intelligence officers who carried the burden of secret knowledge and made life and death decisions based on information they could not fully share. The commanders on both sides who made strategic choices based on incomplete information and assumptions that were sometimes right and sometimes catastrophically wrong. Each person involved was navigating their own circumstances, doing what they believed was right or necessary, and dealing with the consequences of decisions made under pressure and uncertainty. The Japanese admirals who were shocked to learn their codes were broken were not fools or incompetents, but experienced professionals who made reasonable judgments based on what they knew and believed at the time. The fact that those judgments proved wrong does not erase the human reality of people trying to fulfill their responsibilities in impossible circumstances. Historians often consider counterfactual questions, asking what might have happened if circumstances had been different. What if the Japanese had recognized their code compromise after Midway and implemented complete security overhauls? The Pacific War might have lasted longer, with American forces losing some of their intelligence advantages and facing more difficult battles. American casualties would likely have been higher, and the path to victory more costly. What if Japan had never developed complex codes in the first place, instead using simpler systems or being more cautious about radio communications? They might have lost some operational flexibility, but they also might have avoided the systematic intelligence compromise that contributed to their defeat. What if American cryptographers had failed to break JN-25, or had broken it too late to affect battles like Midway? The war's timeline and outcome might have been significantly different, potentially altering when and how the Pacific War ended. These counterfactual questions have no definitive answers, but considering them helps illustrate how important the intelligence dimension was to the actual historical outcome, and how much depended on the successes and failures of codebreakers and security personnel on both sides. When former Japanese naval officers learned in the 1970s just how thoroughly their wartime codes had been compromised, it completed a circle of understanding that had been incomplete for 3 decades. Men who had fought the war finally understood why things had happened as they did, why American forces seemed so well prepared, why ambushes occurred at seemingly impossible moments, and why their confidence in code security had been so tragically misplaced. The revelation brought a mix of shock, dismay, understanding, and perhaps a strange sense of closure. Mysteries that had haunted them for years suddenly made sense. The historical record could finally be understood more completely with this crucial piece of information added. For historians and military analysts, the declassification of code-breaking information transformed understanding of the Pacific War, revealing that intelligence had played an even more central role than previously known. Battles that seemed like close-run things or impressive American victories were revealed to have been shaped significantly by intelligence advantages. Strategic decisions that appeared bold or lucky were shown to have been informed by decoded messages. The declassification created opportunities for more complete historical understanding, while also revealing how much had been hidden and how incomplete the public understanding of the war had been. The story of Japanese admirals shocked by broken codes stands as a monument to the danger of false assumptions and unquestioned confidence. The Japanese Navy was not weak or incompetent. They had skilled officers, advanced technology, and impressive combat capabilities. But they made a critical error in trusting their code security without adequately verifying that trust or responding effectively when evidence suggested problems. This error was enabled by organizational culture that resisted acknowledging bad news, by institutional momentum that made change difficult, and by human psychology that tends to reject information contradicting deeply held beliefs. The consequences of this error were strategic and severe, contributing to Japanese defeat in a war that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaped the world. The American success in breaking Japanese codes was equally a monument to human intelligence, determination, and the power of analytical thinking applied to seemingly impossible problems. Cryptographers who were told that certain codes could not be broken without captured materials proceeded to break those codes anyway through patient work and brilliant insight. The combination of Japanese assumptions and American achievements created one of the most important intelligence advantages in military history and shaped the outcome of the Pacific War in fundamental ways. In the end, the shock that Japanese admirals felt upon learning their codes had been broken throughout the war was the shock of discovering that a foundational belief was wrong, that confidence was misplaced, that the enemy had held an advantage that seemed impossible but was terribly real. This discovery came too late to change what had happened, too late to save the ships that were sunk, the planes that were shot down, the battles that were lost, and the lives that ended because of intelligence advantages they never knew existed. For the men who led the Japanese Navy through desperate years of war, believing their communications were secure, the revelation must have been devastating, forcing them to reconsider every decision, every battle, and every defeat through the lens of compromised codes. The story stands as a powerful reminder that in war and in life, the most dangerous vulnerabilities are often those we do not know we have, the risks we never imagine, and the threats we cannot see because our assumptions blind us. The Japanese admirals who were shocked by their broken codes learned this lesson in the hardest possible way, through defeat, loss, and the bitter knowledge that came too late. Their shock echoes across the decades as a warning about the dangers of unexamined confidence and the critical importance of questioning our assumptions, especially the ones we hold most firmly. In that shock and in that lesson lies a truth that extends far beyond World War II cryptography, touching the fundamental challenge of making decisions with incomplete information, maintaining security against determined adversaries, and avoiding the trap of false certainty in an uncertain world.